первый осенний семестр, сеанс нашего семинара по истории русской литературы. Сегодня имею честь и удовольствие поприветствовать коллегу из Дархамского университета Викторию Ивлеву. Здравствуйте, Вика. Несколько слов сначала о Виктории. Виктория работает associate professor в университете в Дараме. У меня все написано по-английски. С вашим позволением, я, наверное, перейду на английский. Мне кажется, так будет проще. So Victoria is an associate professor at the University of Durham, and she's a well-known specialist of Russian sartorial culture in the 18th and 19th centuries. Her research interests include 17th, 18th, early 19th, and early 20th century Russian literature and culture, dress culture in Imperial Russia, gender studies, the history of cultural import, and material culture. She's the author of numerous articles published in journals such as Textile History, Bibliotheca, Costume, 18th Century Studies, and the Russian Review. In 2016, she co-edited the volume Dress Culture in Imperial Russia, a special issue of the journal Clothing Culture. And Victoria is presently working on a monograph with the current title Fashion to Reign, Identity Politics at Catherine the Great's Court. And this monograph investigates the importance of fashioning strategies and performative practices in the embodiment of sovereignty and governance and relationships between the construction of individual identities and practices of governmentality. Спасибо, Виктория, за этот прекрасный текст. Я бы без вашей помощи не справился, наверное. And the title of the talk today is «Не меховая культура» или «Culture» in Repin's, Gogol's and Pushkin's works about Cossacks. So, dear Vika, the floor is yours. As you remember, you have an hour or so, and then we will dedicate the second hour to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Rodolphe, for this kind introduction and for inviting me to speak about my research today. I feel as though I have already become part of your wonderful community, and I greatly enjoyed all the excellent presentations this term. My presentation will run a little bit over an hour, but I hope to keep it engaging until the very end.
Ничего страшного.
Хорошо. In Ilya Repin's famous painting, the Zaporizhian Cossacks laugh contagiously as they compose an audacious reply to the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed IV. The idea for the painting came to Repin in the summer of 1878 at the house of the philanthropist Sava Mamontov, after he heard the reading of an 18th century copy of the apocryphal letter attributed to the Cossacks. According to legend, Ataman Ivan Sirko and the Cossacks composed this letter in 1676 in response to the Sultan's demand that they submit to his power following their brutal raid on Crimea. The arrogance of the purported letter written by the Sultan, in which he styled himself сын Магомета, брат солнца и луны, внук и наместник Божий, and commanded the Cossacks to surrender добровольно и без всякого сопротивления, provoked their witty rejoinder. They spared no insult in ridiculing the Sultan. Repin worked on this painting for over a decade, finally completing it in 1891. On the one hand, he sought to reproduce a rich variety of individual expressions and shades of laughter. On the other, he meticulously studied the history of the siege. In 1880, he spent half a year in Zaporizhia and Crimea, where he produced hundreds of sketches of people and artifacts. In 1888, he undertook a journey to the Volga and Don regions, and subsequently to the Caucasus and Kuban, to portray the descendants of the Cossacks who had settled there after the dissolution of the host. Leo Tolstoy offered perceptive observations about the painting during a visit to the artist's studio in 1880, And Repin's compatriots, including Dmitry Yavarnitsky, a prominent Ukrainian historian and expert on the Zaporizhian Cossacks, shared historical materials and artifacts with the artists. Several of Repin's friends, some from Ukraine, posed for the figures of the Cossacks, among them Yavarnitsky, who modeled for the clerk. Nikolay Gogol's Ukrainian tales, especially Taras Bulba, inspired both Repin's and Yavarnitsky's interest in Zaporizhian history. In a letter of 7th of November 1880, addressed to an art historian and critic Vladimir Stasov, Repin expressed his admiration for the Cossacks' independence and camaraderie. Недаром про них Гоголь писал «Все это правда». Чертовский народ. Никто на всем свете не чувствовал так глубоко свободы, равенства и братства. Во всю жизнь Запорожье осталось свободно, ничему не подчинилось. An admirer of Gogol, Repin often mentioned the writer in his correspondence. According to his daughter Vera, the artist depicted characters from Taras Bulba in the painting. To the right of the composition stands a laughing Taras Bulba dressed in a red jupan, which is an ankle-length coat sewn from homespun cloth, and a cream-colored sheepskin papacha with a cloth top. Ostap is depicted wearing a black burqa, a round sheepskin cloak typically made of short curly lamb fur, his wounded head wrapped in a bandage. Standing beside him, his younger brother Andrei appears in a dark blue jupan fastened with a red belt. From the runaway student with closely cropped rounded hair to the seasoned warriors whose forelocks, oscillated tube or chuprina, sprout from their polished domes, Repin's figures display a rich spectrum of age, emotional engagement, and attire. In various states of dress and undress, from the half-naked banker unable to conceal cards in his sleeves to the Cossacks clad in overcoats made of animal pelts, such as the one wearing a beige Kobeniak overcoat with a hood with logger, his face and body turned away from the viewer, this vibrant array of figures mirrors the all-encompassing range of their laughter and its unrestrained galvanizing energy. Their attire, characteristic of traditional Cossack dress, highlights their unique identity and reinforces the scene's ethnographic authenticity. These garments evoke all seasons, recalling the words of Gogol's dancing Cossack in Taras Bulba. As sweat pours down his body in buckets, he responds to Taras's suggestion that he remove his sheepskin coat. «Не можно, у меня уж такой нрав, что скину, то пропью». Repin sought to portray a community of free-spirited, defiant individuals whose muscular laughter is rooted in the materiality and visceral vibrations of their bodies. Its excessive and transgressive quality generates an effective spatiality and a form of sensuous solidarity that dissolves social hierarchies. Through this embodied laughter, the Cossacks enact a moment of collective catharsis, projecting synergy, vitality, and confidence. Yet, their laughter simultaneously emerges from a position of perceived superiority, reversing the discursive hierarchy initially imposed by the Sultan's letter in a distinctly carnivalesque manner. Through parody and travesty, forms that also entail critical mimicry, the Cossacks appropriate the Sultan's message, reconfiguring his exalted titles into grotesque inversions that enact a discursive reversal of power. Шайтан турецкий, проклятого черта брат и товарищ, и самого Люцифера секретарь. Thus transforming domination into an instrument of ridicule. The laughter operates ambivalently. It unites and excludes, diffuses intimidation, even as it channels anger, and empowers while simultaneously harboring latent undercurrents of violence. This presentation employs the lens of Repin's painting, its themes, emotions, and visual language to examine Nikolay Gogol's Taras Bulba and Alexander Pushkin's The Captain's Daughter, two works that engage with the complex histories of the Zaporizhian and Yei Cossacks respectively. In both texts, humor and clothing assume central roles. They undermine hierarchies, reshape social worlds, challenge assumptions, and generate new perspectives. As in mock heroic tradition, humor and the comic often arise from episodes of travesty, that is, from moments when clothing and identity fall out of alignment, thereby revealing the disjunctions between expectations, ideal, and reality, and transforming sartorial incongruity into a source of laughter and critique. This presentation, therefore, examines both sartorial cultures and cultures of laughter and laughter, the often interwoven functions of comic and sartorial elements, and considers how these two expressive modes operate as defamiliarizing strategies that complicate and enrich Gogol's and Pushkin's narratives in their explorations of historical and political context, identities, human nature, and the author's own ambivalent allegiances. In the scholarship on laughter, three main theories are commonly identified. The theory of superiority or degradation, which foregrounds the power dynamics of laughter and its connection to mockery. The theory of incongruity or incongruous affinity, which explains laughter as a response to perceived disparity and often links it to ridicule. And the theory of release or relief, which views laughter as a rebellious reaction to social demands, constraints, and repressed uncomfortable emotions. According to Robert Provine, the superiority theory originated in an era when standards of sensibility differed markedly from those of today, an age when, quote, even torture and execution were public events, often conducted in a carnival atmosphere, complete with snacks and refreshments, unquote. Gogol evokes precisely this, such an atmosphere at the end of Taras Bulba in his depiction of Ostap's public execution. Building on these causal theories, scholars distinguish between social positive and social negative, inclusive and exclusive forms of humor and laughter. They view both as communicative tools, as mechanisms of release and resilience, as well as coping or compensatory responses to negative or uncomfortable emotions, such as fear, anger, embarrassment, and hopelessness. Moreover, humor as comic relief can counterbalance violence and suffering, yet it may also acquire deeper, even tragic resonances. Both humor and laughter carry the potential to destabilize normative assumptions, subvert hierarchies, and generate new ways of seeing and thinking, particularly those articulated from marginal positions. By travesty, I mean a comic distortion expressed in Gogol's and Pushkin's fiction through unsuitable dress. I also use other emblematic images that add comic or ironic meanings to Pushkin's text. Both Pushkin and Gogol were familiar with each other's historical fiction and likely exerted mutual influence. In a letter to Vasily Zhukovsky dated April 1837, Gogol recalls discussing the first version of Taras Bulba and its shortcomings with Pushkin and Zhukovsky, and he likely introduced several revisions in the second version based on their advice. Moreover, at the end of his review of the first volume of Gogol's Ukrainian Tales, Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, Pushkin acknowledged that the opening of Taras Bulba was worthy of Walter Scott. Likewise, in a letter of 25th of January 1837 to his friend, the poet and literary critic Nikolay Prokopovich, Gogol expressed his admiration for Pushkin's The Captain's Daughter, published in issue number 4 of The Contemporary in 1836. Paul de Brecheny has also identified stylistic features characteristic of Gogol in Pushkin's novel. While certain narrative and stylistic affinities can be observed between the two works, the present study confines itself to establishing typological parallels. Both authors sought an authentic representation of the national character in their historical fiction, influenced by the romantic ideas advanced by Johann Gottfried von Herder, who advocated the study of the Volksgeist, folk spirit, and emphasized its uniqueness in shaping each nation and its culture. During the Romantic period, historical and ethnographic research gained prominence, and numerous publications on the Cossacks and Ukraine appeared, some of which included descriptions and illustrations of traditional attire. While working on Taras Bulba, Gogol consulted Dmitry Bantysh-Kamensky, History of Little Russia, Guillaume de Beauplans, A Description of Ukraine translated into Russian, and Ismail Sreznevsky's six-volume collection, The Parisian Antiquity, as well as various chronicles and other sources, since he initially intended to write a history of Ukraine. Pushkin, meanwhile, read Alexei Levshin's historical and statistical survey of the Ural Cossacks and description of the Kyrgyz Cossack or Kyrgyz Kaisak hordes and steppes, in addition to diaries and other ethnographic and archival materials while working on a history of Pugachev and the Captain's Daughter. Both authors were also familiar with the history of the Rus or Little Russia, attributed to George Kaninsky. The ethnographic case, adopted in both historical research and fiction, offering an outsider's perspective and often resisting official ideology, may likewise have appealed to both writers. During and after the Napoleonic Wars, the Cossacks' military prowess captured the Russian and European imagination, inspiring numerous early 19th century popular comic prints that depicted them alongside the Kalmyks or evoked their image in portrayals of Napoleon and the French army to underscore the dramatic reversal of fortune. The widespread fascination with the Cossacks, their perceived independence, rebellious spirit, and marginality, exemplified by their disenfranchisement and itinerant existence on the imperial periphery, may also have attracted Gogol and Pushkin to their histories. Both authors themselves occupied positions of partial marginality, Pushkin as the great-grandson of Abram Ganibal, an African-born former captive who rose to prominence in Russia, and as a poet who spent considerable time in exile. And Gogol as a descendant of the 16th century Ukrainian Cossack colonel and later hetman Yevstafi Ostap Gogol, and as a writer who spent much of his life in Russia and abroad. This shared experience of cultural and geographic displacement informs their literary sensibilities. In Boris Godunov, for instance, Pushkin's Holy Fool occupies a similar marginal position, and echoes of Skomorokh culture can be still discerned in the play's final version. In Gogol's case, following the publication of his Ukrainian tales, he sought to highlight not only his metropolitan fashionability through dress, but also his Ukrainian heritage through the distinctive coiffure, a tuft of hair over his forehead, chachul. This hairstyle introduced an ambiguity. While it evoked the early 19th century coq de cheveux, it also resembled the traditional Ukrainian tube, thereby embodying the tension between cultural assimilation and national identity that marked Gogol's public persona. The romantic fascination with ethnic identities, combined with the urban ethos of dandyism, offered Gogol an opportunity to express his hybrid identity, that of a Ukrainian author fluent in European and Russian cultures, yet writing in Russian. This identity, as Yulia Ilchuk and Daniel Green observe, is visible in Alexei Venetzianov's portrait of the dandiacal, high-spirited Gogol with a roguish smile. Gogol's close friend, Nikolay Prokopovich, referred to this portrait as that of the author of Taras Bulba, likely perceiving a resemblance between Gogol's rebellious chachul and the Cossack's forelocks, and appreciating the writer's bold and animated expression. The word chachul has long carried pejorative connotations, suggesting a stubborn and sly Ukrainian. Gogol's multi-layered self-travestying image thus encapsulates the paradox of marginality shared by both authors. In moments of political repression after the Decembrist uprising of 1825 and the Polish uprising of 1830-1831, humor and travesty functioned as forms of defamiliarization, and for writers like Pushkin and Gogol, as subtle yet potent instruments of subversion and empowerment. As Serhiy Plokhy notes, the Polish insurrection of 1830-1831 deepened Gogol's fascination with Ukraine and the Zaporizhian Cossacks, whose first host, or siege, established itself beyond the rapids, Zaporogami, of the Dnieper River around the 15th century and entered Polish records in the following century. The term siege, from sikti to chop, refers both to the Cossacks' fortified encampment and to their military administrative organization. According to Igor Vinogradov, the fact that Poles had fought on the side of Napoleon in 1812 may also have influenced Gogol's choice of subject for Daria's Bulba. The uprising of 1638, led by Hetman Yakov Ostryanin against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which at the time threatened the Cossacks' free existence, provides a historical backdrop for Gogol's narrative. Written in Russian, Gogol's tale nonetheless incorporates Ukrainian words to evoke local color and to shape his vision of history, an aesthetic choice that reflects both romantic taste and his negotiation of a hybrid identity. When Gogol speaks of the Russian land, he invokes the term in its oldest sense, suggesting, following Oleg Ilnitsky's reading, that Ukraine's historical lineage reaches back to Kievan Rus, and that the Cossacks embody the continuity of this ancestral heritage. This usage of the adjective wasn't unique to Gogol. It appears frequently in Polish and Cossack documents and in early 19th century depictions of Ukraine. Yet the very ambiguity of this expression may have enabled Gogol to circumvent censorship. In Taras Bulba, he envisions Ukraine as the cradle of the Slavic world, transforming the Cossack Wars into a distinctly Slavic counterpart of the medieval Crusades. In the essay about Middle Ages, Gogol writes admiringly of the greatness and originality that characterized the struggle for faith. In Taras Bulba, Gogol underscores the siege's republican ethos and its collective modes of decision-making. According to Serhiy Plokhy, these ideas were central to Kanitsky's vision of Zaporizhian history, which likely captured the imagination of Gogol, Pushkin, and the Decembrists. The Decembrist Southern Society advocated replacing autocracy with a republican form of government. While romanticizing Cossack culture and its representatives, both Gogol and Pushkin also depict them as tainted by violence. Both writers construct their characters as complementary pairs of opposites that offer contrasting perspectives, while simultaneously revealing underlying affinities, thereby adding depth and complexity to their characterization. The aesthetics of Gogol's art draws inspiration from the vertep puppet theater, which alternated between serious scriptural mystery plays and secular folk and comic scenes. In the latter, a Zaporizhian Cossack often took a center stage, alongside figures representing other national and ethnic types, such as a Muscovite, a Pole, and a Jew. Gogol's tale opens with a scene of travesty, as Taras mocks his son's appearance on their return home after completing their education in Kyiv. «А поворотись-ка, сын, какой ты смешной какой! Что это на вас за поповские подрясники? И это все ходят в академии». This mockery arises from the incongruity Taras perceives in his son's unmanly attire. He judges them from a position of superiority, and Gogol thus stages the first contrast between divergent world and value systems in the tale. Ostap and Andrei's long coats worn during their seminary studies make them resemble monks and even evoke associations with female dress, specifically their mother's petticoat. In the Cossack worldview, petticoats symbolize proximity to women, weakness, and the lack of manliness. Determined to harden his sons and restore their masculine vigor, Taras resolves to take them to the siege, where they can become independent and mature Cossack warriors. As Gary Rosenschild observes, quote, dress is an essential element of Gogol's comic art, unquote. The motif of travesty recurs throughout the tale in Gogol's portrayals of Andrei, the Jews, and ultimately Taras, transforming what begins as comic inversion into an expression of human fragility and vulnerability. This episode, when read alongside the scene in which the Polish maiden drapes Andrei, a Kievan seminarian, in a transparent muslin chemisette with gold-embroidered festoons, which is a small cape, foreshadows his eventual betrayal of the Cossacks. In the Catholic Church in Dubna, Andrei observes two young choristers wearing chemisettes over their mantles, an image that recalls the earlier scene and reinforces Gogol's symbolic use of dress. In both instances, Gogol establishes a parallel. Like the choristers, Andrei serves those whom he reveres. The Polish maiden first initiates Andrei into her service comically by placing the chemisette on his shoulders, and later more solemnly as her knight, by presenting him with a scarf embroidered by her own hand. When Taras and his sons set out for the siege, the young men appear wholly transformed. Their richly adorned garments marking the passage from youth to Cossack manhood. Gogol's use of vivid hyperbolic imagery, сафьянные сапоги красные с серебряными подковами, шаровары шириною в Черное море, казакин алого цвета, сукна яркого, как огонь, underscores the Cossack's vitality and expansiveness, qualities that he aligns with the unbounded space of the steppe. In the romantic spirit of Herder, Gogol believed that geography exerted a formative influence on national character. In his essay, A Glance at the Making of Little Russia, he draws a parallel between the Cossack satire and their native landscape. Their half-Tatar, half-Polish dress, comprising on the one hand Eastern shalvars, loose-fitting trousers gathered at the ankles, and on the other, though not in Taras Bulba, garments such as the jupan and kuntush embodies the liminal character of their homeland. In the tale, the new garments worn by Ostap and Andrei symbolize their initiation into the Cossack brotherhood, representing not only a change in appearance, but also a deeper reconnection with the steppe and the ancestral values it embodies. Yet, despite his vivid attention to the color and richness of Cossack dress, Gogol repeatedly stresses the Cossacks' indifference and at times outright contempt for material wealth. He introduces this theme early in the tale, when Taras laments that many nobles are adopting Polish customs and introducing luxuries, a development deeply displeasing to him, for he loves the simple life of the Cossacks. Upon entering the siege, Taras admires the Cossacks lying on the road, who displays utter disregard for his own opulent garments, a vivid embodiment of the Cossack ideal of freedom from worldly vanity. Запорожец, как лев, растянулся на дороге, закинутый гордо чуб захватывал на поларшина земли, шаровары алого дорогого сукна были запачканы дегтем для показания полного к ним презрения. Gogol once again resorts to larger-than-life imagery to render this performative spectacle. At the same time, he comically underscores the Cossacks' indifference to material possessions through exaggeration and incongruous juxtapositions, contrasting his overconfidence, eccentric leisure, the surrounding mud, and his casual disregard for his own finery. As the Cossacks prepare for a military campaign, their leader reminds them, Не забирайте много с собой одежды, по сорочке и по двое шаровар на казака. Here, Gogol faithfully reproduces details drawn from Boblan's account, translated into Russian, which Zhizhnevsky also includes in his ethnographic collection. On campaign, the Cossacks' clothing typically consisted of a shirt, 2 pairs of shalvars, 1 pair for change, and a kaftan and a hat. As Gary Rosenschild observes, within the Cossack brotherhood, any pursuit of goods or trading was regarded as incompatible with Christian and knightly ideals, and by implication, a kind of Judaization. True to this ethos, the Cossacks don't adorn themselves for battle, and the Cossack tempted by material possessions meets an untimely death, as in the case of Borodaty, who disregards his leader's injunction to take only weapons from the Poles and to abstain from both booty and petticoats. И польстился корыстью бородатый, нагнулся, чтобы снять с него дорогие доспехи, вынул уже турецкий нож в оправе из самоцветных каменьев, отвязал от пояса черенок с червонцами и не услышал бородатый, как налетел на него сзади красноносый хорунжий. Не к добру повела корысть казака. The Cossacks' freedom and republican order fascinated Gogol, who describes in detail various rituals associated with their self-governance. These ceremonies often involve taking off or putting on a hat as a sign of humility, respect, or gratitude, or as an acknowledgement of authority, power, or conversely, a gesture of disrespect. Gogol may have derived the idea of incorporating hats in Cossacks' rituals from the history of the Rus, or Little Russia, whose author describes a similar ritual performed during the election of a hetman. Through these ritualized gestures, Gogol not only records the customs of the Cossacks, but also constructs a symbolic sartorial language that encodes questions of identity, hierarchy, and belonging. Gogol juxtaposes the simplicity of Cossack attire with the opulence of Polish dress, repeatedly invoking images of gold to heighten this contrast. Не было на них ни на ком золота, не любили казаки богато выряжаться на битвах, простые были на них кольчуги и свиты. This passage implicitly juxtaposes Cossacks' utilitarian battle attire with the opulent dress of the Poles, described earlier in the tale. Through this contrast, Gogol underscores the performative nature of Polish dressing practices and conveys implicit disapproval, an attitude expressed here through the verb выряжаться, to dress up. He employs this verb with implied reference to the Poles, thereby associating them with excess and vanity. This perception likely reflects a broader tradition in Ukrainian chronicles, which mocked Polish habits of adornment even in wartime. Both Johann Christian von Engel, in his History of Ukraine and Ukrainian Cossacks, and Bantysz Kamensky, in his History of Ukraine, draw on such chronicles, noting that Polish forces dressed as if for a wedding rather than for battle. By echoing this critical tradition, Gogol reinforces a long-standing contrast between Polish ostentation and Cossack austerity. Whereas the Cossacks' attire embodies their collective spirit, Polish nobles use dress to assert individuality and social rank. Yet Gogol's keen aesthetic sensibility tempers moral critique. His luxuriant descriptions of Polish costume are as lyrical and evocative as his portrayal of Cossack dress. Медные шапки сияли, как солнце, оперенные белыми, как лебедь, перьями. На других были легкие шапочки, розовые и голубые, с перегнутыми на бекрень верхами. Кафтаны с откидными рукавами, шитые золотом и просто выложенные шнурками. Although Gogol draws some sartorial details from historical sources, he transforms them through metaphor and simile into richly poetic imagery. Moreover, he introduces significant distinctions in his representations of costumes, especially in their national or communal variations. For instance, Rezhnevsky notes that the Zaporizhian Cossacks wore a garment similar to the kuntush, a long outer robe whose sleeves were designed with front openings, allowing for different ways of wearing them. One such style involved opening the sleeves and throwing them back, as described in the previous example. The Cossacks also wore the zhupan. In the 17th century, however, both the kuntush and the zhupan had become distinctive elements of Polish national dress, and in Gogol's tale, only the Poles are depicted wearing them. This selective attribution may have been influenced by vertep theater, in which costumes served to identify different national or ethnic types. Thus, only Polish characters appeared in kuntush. Building on this symbolic use of clothing, Gogol employs a travel motive in which changes of costume signify transformations in his characters' identities and then times their allegiances. He presents Andrei's shift in loyalty prompted by his feelings for the Polish maiden through the eyes of the other, Yankel, the Jew, who brings this dreadful news to Taras. Their dialogue produces a comic effect through the incongruity between Taras's and Yankel's systems of values and the misunderstandings that arise from them. While Yankel admires Andrei's attire and repeats the word gold 8 times in the original text, more frequently than in any descriptions of the Polish nobles, within Taras's moral framework, gold carries only negative connotations. For Yankel, Andrei's betrayal of the Cossacks appears unproblematic. For Taras, it constitutes a violation of all that is sacred to him, his brotherhood, his native land, and his faith. И наплечники в золоте, и нарукавники в золоте, и зерцало в золоте, и шапка в золоте, и по поясу золото, и везде золото, все золото. Так как солнце взглянет весною, так и он весь сияет золото. Зачем же он надел чужие одеяния? Потому что лучше, потому и надел. Так это выходит, он, по-твоему, продал отчизную веру? Я же не говорю этого, чтобы он продавал что. Я сказал только, что он перешел к ним. Yankel's mediation, along with his attempt to explain Andrei's behavior to Taras as he understands it, proves unsuccessful. It is worth noting that in the final version of the tale, Gogol significantly develops Andrei's character, rendering him more appealing, sensitive, and open-minded. He removes the references to Andrei's cowardice from the episode of his final encounter with his father and instead emphasizes Andrei's vulnerability, while making Taras more unwavering and uncompromising. As Andrei, still alive, enters Dubna besieged by the Cossacks, Gogol once again shifts perspective, allowing the reader to see the war, the Catholic monks, and the city's suffering inhabitants through Andrei's sympathetic eyes. The town's earthen walls remind Andrei of the catacombs of Kiev, suggesting that Poland doesn't appear so different from Ukraine. One may wonder, therefore, whether Andrei's shifting allegiances mirror Gogol's own complex heritage and artistic vulnerabilities. Gogol also introduces two further episodes of travesty, in which changes of dress entail transformations of identity, each centered on the motif of intentional disguise. In the first, Ataman Musi Shila, a Cossack likely of Jewish origin, successfully deceives both his Turkish captors and his countrymen by switching allegiances and subversively mimicking the captor's identity through the act of donning a Turkish turban. Notably, Gogol uses the feminine noun chilma for this headwear in Russian. Musi's disguise enables him to free his compatriots from captivity. Не вытерпел атаман Муси Шила, скверную челмою обвил грешную голову, вошел в доверенность к паше. И когда турки, обрадовавшись, что достали себе такого слугу, стали пировать, он принес все 64 ключа и раздал невольникам, чтобы отмыкали себя. In the second episode, Taras hides beneath a pile of bricks at the bottom of Yankel's wagon. as they travel to Warsaw, determined to see his son Ostap before his execution. On Yankel's advice, he later disguises himself as a foreign count just arrived from Germany. His disguise, the unfamiliar environment, and the experience of alterity make him acutely uncomfortable. Instead of remaining invisible and unrecognizable, he exposes his true identity when a Pole begins cursing the Cossacks and their faith. More importantly, Taras's confinement in Yankel's wagon and his new costume render him, as Rosenschild observes, smaller, Jew-like. These scenes create another form of comic incongruity, this time between Taras's larger-than-life persona, his foreign attire, and the small, unfamiliar spaces he inhabits. Yet the humor also derives from Gogol's use of the mundus inversus topos, a reversal of roles and power between Taras and Yankel. In this inverted situation, Taras becomes vulnerable and dependent on Yankel, even if only briefly. This vulnerability aligns him with his sons, dressed in the ridiculous frocks at the beginning of the tale, with Andrei in his gold-embroidered chemisette, and with the captured Cossacks caught off guard without their shalvars and outer garments. Likewise, before their execution, the Cossacks' tattered clothing recalls the ragged scalp caps worn by the Jews before being killed. This recurring motive of vulnerability bridges the divisions that war and conflicting value systems create among Gogol's characters, and Gogol is at his most profound when his unifying aesthetic vision transcends rigid moral judgment. A comparable fascination with Cossack life and its historical legacy appears in the work of Pushkin, who, like Gogol, was deeply interested in the history of the Cossacks. The Kepsin's daughter engages with the history of a major uprising within the Russian Empire, the rebellion led by the Don Cossack Emelian Pugachev in 1773-1774. The Don Cossack host, based in the Don region, was second in prominence only to the Zaporizhian host. Both Don and Zaporizhian Cossacks at times fought together against the Poles and Tatars, as during the uprising of 1638 mentioned in Gogol's tale. The death of Catherine II's husband, Peter III, during her coup, gave rise to several pretenders who claimed to have survived the assassination. Pugachev was one of them. His rebellion attracted a large following among the Yaik Cossacks who inhabited the Yaik River region in the Urals. Although imperial forces eventually suppressed the uprising, it exposed deep economic and social grievances within the empire. 5 days after Pugachev's execution in January 1775, Catherine II renamed the Yaik Cossacks and the Yaik River as the Ural Cossacks and the Ural River, seeking to erase the memory of the rebellion. Later the same year, she disbanded the Zaporizhian siege in response to its separatist tendencies. Pushkin, however, sought to preserve the memory of this rebellion by composing both a historical study and a novel devoted to the uprising. By the time Pushkin began working on these projects, Nicholas I had appointed him state historiographer and granted him partial access to archival materials. Pushkin also traveled to the Urals to interview surviving witnesses of the rebellion. After undertaking extensive research, he first composed the history of Pugachev and then turned to fiction, writing The Captain's Daughter. Most, if not all, Don and Yaik Cossacks were old believers and wore beards. Unlike the Zaporizhian Cossacks, they didn't shave their heads, but cropped their hair around the crown. They also wore shalvars. It is difficult to determine how sincere Pugachev was in his religious convictions, but he likely sought to demonstrate solidarity with the Cossacks by adopting their faith and appearance. Pushkin's novel follows Petrusha Grinev, a 16-year-old nobleman sent to serve in a remote Belogorsk fortress in the Urals, later besieged by Pugachev. where Petrusha falls in love with Masha, the captain's daughter. The novel is framed as a family memoir in which Petrusha recounts the events of the rebellion and the unexpected affinity he develops with its leader. As he departs for the military service, his father offers him advice ending with a proverb: «Береги платье снова, а честь молоду». Like Andrei in Gogol's tale, Petrusha disobeys the paternal counsel when he gives his hareskin coat, zaичий тулуп, a coat made of pelt with a fur on the inside, to Pugachev in gratitude for helping him during a snowstorm. Pugachev, who has pawned his sheepskin coat, is dressed only in a ragged jerkin, armyak, a wide and long coat resembling a dressing gown, made of coarse camel's or sheep's wool cloth, and in Tatar trousers. Alexei Levshin lists the armyak among the garments worn by Ural Cossacks at home, along with the khalat, dressing gown. As David Bitey observes, Petrusha keeps his honor by not keeping his dress intact. Scholars have examined the multiple functions of the coat in Pushkin's poetic novel. According to Bitey, the garment initiates the processes of Slavic gift-giving and self-giving. Alexander Dolinin interprets it as introducing a theme of caritative ethics that fosters compassionate relationships among the characters. Amanda Murphy, in turn, observes that the child's coat, too small for Pugachev's body and bursting at the seams, foreshadows the violence of the uprising. Pushkin may also have encoded personal and historical references in Petrusha's coat, linking it to both the Decembrist uprising and chance occurrences in his own life. According to his contemporaries, Pushkin regarded an episode in which a hare crossed his path as he prepared to travel to St. Petersburg on the eve of the uprising as a bad omen and decided to stay home. After execution of 5 Decembrists by hanging, the image of the gallows haunted Pushkin. He even sketched it, noting that he too might have been hanged like a jester. Я бы мог как шут. Likewise, in the novel, Petrusha is repeatedly drawn to the gallows where Pugachev executes his comrades, but spares his life in remembrance of his gift. After the Decembrist uprising, the Tsar unexpectedly pardoned Pushkin. Thus, the hare omen ultimately played a positive role in his fate, leading eventually to his marriage, much as it does in the novel. Following the attack on the fort, Pugachev reciprocates Petrusha's generosity by gifting him a sheepskin coat after the rebels strip him of his clothing, even of his unworn uniform. The loss of this uniform may also carry autobiographical resonance. When Pushkin was appointed to the minor court rank of Kamerjanker, gentleman of the emperor's bedchamber, a title granted so that his wife might be received at court, he deeply resented being forced to wear a uniform. The Tsar's decision imposed upon the author, who had recently completed a history of Pugachev, what Pushkin perceived as a courtier's shackles, unbecoming for a nobleman with ancient lineage. In The Captain's Daughter, as Amanda Murphy convincingly demonstrates, the traditional garments worn by characters, including those on opposing sides of the conflict, such as Petrusha and Pugachev, underscore their shared roots and create a common cultural ground. Pushkin links Vasilisa Yegorovna, the wife of the fort's commandant and Masha's mother, to Catherine II in a similar way, through the padded jackets known in Russian as tilagrika, a body warmer, and the dushegreika, soul warmer. The two garments were similar in design and could be made with or without sleeves, though the body warmer originally covered the whole body and was sometimes lined with fur. Yet the sartorial connection between Vasilisa and the second is complicated by the fact that the brigand who robs Vasilisa of her body warmer later dons this garment, ironically called a soul warmer in this instance, implying that the robber is also a murderer, dushegubец. Figuratively speaking, then, the garment passes to Catherine not directly from Vasilisa, but through the robber. These details suggest that Pushkin implicates Catherine II both in the murder of her husband and in the rebellion led by the Cossack impersonating him. Early in the novel, Vasilisa dresses her daughter in a sarafan, a sleeveless peasant dress, to protect her from the rebels. Livshin mentions both sarafans and short fur coats, likely a kind of body warmer, as garments worn by women in the Urals. Despite these sartorial complications introduced by Pushkin, it is ultimately the character's capacity for empathy and compassion that unites them across social and ideological divides. At the same time, the novel also carries an ironic dimension. As Danon Guriana observes, many episodes reveal elements of travesty that generate both comic and subversive effects, much like in Gogol's tale. Pugachev refers to the exchange gifts as fur coats from a master's shoulder, шуба с барского плеча, an idiomatic expression alluding to the custom by which a prince or a boyar rewarded loyal service with a costly fur garment. Such gifts, treasured and worn only on special occasions, function both as tokens of gratitude and as symbols of power, reinforcing a social hierarchy in which those higher on the ladder bestowed garments upon their inferiors. In Pushkin's novel, the hareskin and sheepskin coats simultaneously affirm and destabilize traditional hierarchy, exposing the volatility of a world where servants become masters and hunters become prey. Like Gogol's tale, the captain's daughter opens with an act of travesty. A figure who resembles a wolf, a lupus in Latin, dons the skin of a hare, lepus, an animal marked by vulnerability. And one cannot help but wonder whether Pushkin stages a kind of social comedy here. As Pugachev later confides to Petrusha, «Мне должно держать ухо востро. При первой неудаче они, his fellows, свою душу выкупят моею головою». Moreover, Pushkin may have chosen the hareskin coat with deliberate linguistic irony. The species of hair whose gray fur was used for such garments is called rusak in Russian, a word that also denotes a simple Russian, someone intimately attuned to the essence of folk life. In The Captain's Daughter, Pushkin repeatedly employs the device of travesty to construct a world of inversion and disguise. Through his depictions of the Belagorsk fort, the Orenburg fortress, Pugachev impersonation of Peter I, Shvabrin's shifting loyalties, and even Catherine II's Petrusha's and Masha's adoption of peasant or traditional dress, Pushkin presents a topsy-turvy world in which characters on one level appear as descendants of the Skomorokh tradition, folk mummers performing the roles of disguise and transformation. Ivan Snigirev, whom Pushkin knew personally and whose ethnographic research interested him, described mummery as a form of folk masquerade. Such masquerades, however, can be understood more broadly as embodying the semantics of inversion through ritualized shape-shifting, оборотничество. The donning of animal skins or touloupes turned inside out symbolically reverses the natural order and grants temporary access to a liminal realm where hierarchies are suspended and identities become fluid. Pushkin anticipates the importance of this mundus inversus topus through the motif of the snowstorm, which simultaneously scrambles distinctions and opens a space for play, experimentation, and assumption of new roles. In the snowstorm scene, Petrusha mistakes a small white cloud, which will later reveal its silver lining, for a distant hill. that same little cloud grows into a concealing white cumulus, while the driver peering ahead describes Pugachev's dark silhouette as или волк, или человек. The confusion of perception here enacts the logic of memory itself, the blending of human and animal, ruler and impostor, truth and illusion. Like the mummers who donned animal hides reversed to loops and archaic or tattered garments, incongruous with their social status, provoking both laughter and fear, Pushkin's characters participate in a ritual of inversion that is at once protective and transformative, a play of disguise that wards off evil even as it exposes the fragility of social identity. Several figures in the captain's daughter appear in animal skins, rags, forms of disguise, and don figurative masks. Pugachev in particular embodies the role of an ideal maludans, a player who merges the functions of mom, wolf, guide, vajati, with those of mediator, pretender to the throne, and Pugach, one who frightens. Pushkin himself playfully invokes this last association in a poem written on 18th of January, 1836, which he sent to Denis Davidov together with his History of Pugachev. Within the novel, the motive of protective concealment, rooted in the folk traditions of memory, carries both practical and magical overtones. It manifests not only garments and hairstyles, such as touloupes, a sarafan or Schwabian's altered appearance, but also through the use of an allegorical or coded language, as in the scene between Keeper and Pugachev, where Petrusha fails to understand a single word. Pushkin may be deliberately playing on the dual meaning of the word zagovor, which denotes both conspiracy and incantation, by aligning the plotting with the act of casting a spell. And allegiances and experience forms of alterity that, as in Gogol, reveal the porous boundaries between the self and the other, truth and deception, history and myth. In The Captain's Daughter, the experience of alterity often becomes a site of mutual recognition, enabling characters to perceive and understand one another across boundaries of class, loyalty, and identity. Moments of travesty, when characters exchange, mimic, or parody social roles, often generate comic effects through the destabilization of established hierarchies and the incongruity between authentic and assumed identities. Such episodes often rely on exaggerated imitation or mechanical repetition, as exemplified in the appearance or behavior of Shvabrin, Pugachev, and his Cossack followers. Moreover, like Gogol, Pushkin employs comedy not merely for amusement, but also as a means of revealing the underlying common humanity of ostensibly opposed figures, and as a narrative strategy of relief that counterbalances the pervasive violence of the rebellion. Savelyich's listing of the garments stolen from Petrusha by Pugachev's men exemplifies this technique. The comic misunderstanding tinged with travesty momentarily diffuses the horror of the preceding execution scene and restores a fragile sense of moral and emotional equilibrium. Pushkin begins to encode the semantics of memory early in The Captain's Daughter through the image of Petrusha's kite with its bass tail appended to the Cape of Good Hope, and through the name of Schwabrin, reminiscent of his prototype Schwanwich, yet derived from Schwaber, mop, made of the same bast material as the kite's tail. The bast tail thus functions both as a factual detail within the empirical world of the novel and as a component of a broader semantic network and cultural code that generates the work's parodic and travesty dimension. The broom, mitla, or pomelo, an implement related to the mop and etymologically connected to metil, snowstorm, was a traditional attribute of folk mummers. Within the novel, the anti-hero Schwabrin assumes the role of an informal mummer who effortlessly shifts identities and allegiances, serving as travesty double of both Petrusha and Pugachev in certain situations. It is also likely not accidental that Pushkin named his protagonist Petrushka or Petrusha, recalling the stock hero of the Russian puppet theater, akin to the vertep. At the same time, Petrusha and his loyal servant Savelich evoke a Cervantine pair of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. When Petrusha approaches the Belagorsk fort, he perceives a travestied image of a sagging windmill with idly drooping mast sails in place of fearsome bastions, a moment that playfully fuses Cervantine parody with folk mummery. Pushkin's novel thus shares with Cervantes' Don Quixote and Gogol's tale the coexistence of tragic and comic playings. The laughter of travesty intertwines with the pathos of moral and historical crisis. Both the snowstorm and the gallows in The Captain's Daughter serve as emblems of disruption and suspended order. The gallows, in particular, becomes a mundus inversus, a world turned upside down, where the social hierarchy collapses and the very center of gravity shifts at the moment of execution. Pushkin further encodes the semantics of inversion and mummery through the popular print hanging in the commandant's house, depicting a cat being buried by mice. Ivan Snegiryov observes that this widely circulated lobok was often read in political terms, including as a parodic representation of Peter I's burial by the Old Believers. While this interpretation resonates with the contemporary context of renewed Old Believer unrest, the image more broadly underscores the arbitrariness and impermanence of social hierarchy. It casts an ironic light on the figures of authority within the novel, Catherine II and Pugachev, both of whom appear as impostors performing theatrical roles. The mimicry of sovereign power contributes to the desacralization of authority that lies at the heart of Pushkin's vision of history as a stage of ceaseless travesty and inversion. This same principle of parody extends to the provincial microcosm of the Belagorsk fortress, where, as Bette and Murphy observe, quote, the fort presents a parodic version of Catherine's matriarchal Russia, unquote, ruled not by imperial decree, but by the commandant's wife, Vasilisa Yegorovna, who exercises authority without holding any official power. By dressing the commandant in a nightcap and a dressing gown for military exercise, Pushkin underscores the fort's comic unpreparedness for battle. The aged veterans with their braids further heighten the sense of farce. They appear more suited to agricultural labor than to warfare. The Russian word kosa, meaning both braid and scythe, intensifies this ambiguity, linking the comic image of these anachronist soldiers to the memento mori of the scythe, and by extension to the deathly undertones of mummery. The commandant's travestied costume, a cap and a dressing gown, belongs to the sphere of private life, domesticity, and within the romantic tradition signifies a realm of personal freedom. These comic and domestic motifs suggest that The Captain's Daughter is as much a homely tale as a historical one, inviting the attentive reader to discern in it a subtext of irony and free-spirited play. As Pushkin confessed to his friend Петр Вяземский after completing Борис Годунов, да никак не мог упрятать всех моих ушей под колпак юродивого, торчат. This self-ironic remark reveals the playful, self-aware quality that also permeates The Captain's Daughter. Pushkin extends the principle of travesty to the episode in which Shvabrin shifts his allegiances, dons a Cossack kaftan, and has his hair cropped after the Cossack fashion, as well as to his portrayal of Pugachev, whom he depicts as a roguish yet compelling figure, whose duplicity becomes a source of both menace and fascination. Both Pushkin and Petrusha are drawn to Pugachev, who receives considerably more narrative attention than Catherine II, yet neither can accept his violence. In the scenes where Pugachev impersonates Peter III, Pushkin emphasizes the sham nature of these performances. Pugachev's red Cossack kaftan is edged with galloons like an officer's uniform. His tall sable hat may recall the monarch's cap, but is not quite the same. And his cottage, adorned with gold and paper, is but a parody of imperial splendor, with his followers feigning their look of servility. These transformations bear the same sense of incompleteness and theatricality characteristic of Mamre. Not everything is entirely what it seems in The Captain's Daughter, just as in Gogol's tale. But both authors share a humanistic impulse that tempers violence through humor and compassion. For Pushkin and Gogol alike, laughter becomes an antidote to cruelty and the means of recovering a sense of shared collective identity rooted in folk culture and communal imagination. Both drew upon ethnographic and historical sources to lend authenticity to their depictions of period, costume, and character, though Pushkin employed such materials more sparingly than Gogol. Each used travesty not only for comic effect, but also to evoke the topos of mundus inversus, allowing their characters to experience alterity and to reveal their shared vulnerabilities and common humanity. Both writers, moreover, inscribe humorous self-portraits within their works. Pushkin, the devoted family man, imagined himself as an old cannon, stuffed with rags, pebbles, bits of wood and bone, and other rubbish that the children have thrown in there, while Gogol envisioned himself as the proud river duck gliding swiftly over the Dniester. Finally, if we look closely at Repin's reply of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, it is tempting to recognize not Yevarnitsky, but Gogol himself in the figure of the clerk, the writer among his own creations, savoring every word of the Cossack letter. Thank you.
Thank you, Vika. Thank you very much. Let me react. There you go. One more round of applause. Thank you so much. Well, I can do all these effects. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Okay, last round of applause. All right, thank you. Okay, so great talk, very informative, very, very informative. I mean, I had, I struggled writing down everything that I wanted to write down because there are so many things that I didn't know. And it's really, really an enriching reading of these works that we're not familiar with. It's really a wonderful angle, sartorial culture, and that's what you do. So that's really great. All right. Colleagues, students, please, questions, remarks. Juliette, пожалуйста.
Yeah, thank you very much for this brilliant and very stimulating and enriching presentation. Well, I have two little questions. My first question concerns vocabulary, terminology. So you said the word Cossack comes from a Turkish word meaning the wanderer.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering which word is it in Turkish, if you know it.
Uh-huh.
And my second question is more general and it concerns the title of your presentation. It's how would you translate the mekhovaia into English?
Okay, thank you very much, Juliet. Unfortunately, I don't know the Turkish word, so I just consulted the dictionary, but I didn't write down the Turkish word. But what is interesting about Cossacks themselves and the word Kazakh is that before Cossacks we usually talk about them in connection with Ukraine, starting from somewhere at the end of the 15th century, maybe even 16th century, because the first Polish records list them in the 16th century, and about Russian Cossacks, probably from the 16th century. But the word itself previously referred actually to Tatars. So before the 15th century, these were Tatars who were called Cossacks. So it was more, I mean, a term connected with ethnicity rather than with anything else. And of course, I mean, when we talk about either Ukrainian Cossacks or Russian Cossacks, we have to also understand that they included a lot of different ethnicities, in fact, you know, and there were even, especially among Ukrainian Cossacks, for example, there were representatives from Europe, for instance, from different parts of Europe. And even Gogol, to some extent, noted that some of them were Jews, actually. That probably, I mean, he doesn't talk about this kind of directly, but we can infer that from the names. It's actually, I mean, before I wrote this paper, I at first came up with the title, and one of my colleagues said that, you know, that I have to write about it. So the title came before the talk, so to speak. But the title, mekhovaia, means fur, so fur culture. Mekhovaia means the culture of laughter. And of course, ne means neither this or not that, so it incorporates everything. But by adding this negative portion, I meant to also kind of reflect more on what the culture of laughter does, actually. I mean, it's not, we have to take it seriously, so to speak, and it's not always about humor, so it does something else as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliette, and thank you, Vika. Пожалуйста, Даша.
Dasha.
Thank you. Maybe there was a question before mine?
I don't
No?
think so. Well,
No?
there's one coming, but
Okay, because I
go
wanted
first.
a bit more time to formulate it, but that's okay. Thank you so much again, first of all, for this absolutely fascinating talk. I also learned a lot, and I especially loved the part about Pushkin, but in the end, actually everything came together, and it was wonderful. I do have more comments / questions about the second part, because what you said about this, let's say, how did you formulate it? How did you turn it? Carnival culture, this upside down thing. So what interests me is what everything you said about Pugachev, and also this wearing of typically woman's clothing, so the heart warmer, etc. And this made me think of a very famous poem. So I'm not at all a specialist of the 19th century. I'm a specialist of Russian modernism. So this made me think of a famous Yesenin's poem, Письмо матери, so the letter to the mother, in which there's this also very famous phrase, verse, you will come and meet me on the road wearing your old heart warmer, ветхом шушуне. And so there was, I don't know how many kilometers of of commentary written about this verse, about this ветхий шушун. And maybe even the most smart between these comments actually said that it maybe even didn't mean anything. There maybe even wasn't even a word like this existing in real life, but it designated a piece of clothing that referred to this old peasant world. And but of course it made me think, actually, after what you have said about Pushkin, about this whole tradition of dressing of the author dressing as much as the character is dressing as this as this person who impersonates something else. And so I was thinking if maybe one can draw a link between Yesenin's verse and this tradition of Pushkin's dressing. And everything is said about, of course, this kalpak, etc., etc. So this was interesting, and I was also wondering if you knew of other traditions, lines that you could draw from Pushkin and Gogol, and everything is said about clothing into the 20th century, into the reception of these works. Is it something that was seen also by readers of Pushkin and Gogol? Maybe in adaptations, I had also a question about how all this was seen and put into play, maybe, you know, in Russian cinema in the 20th century, everything that is regards this clothing in the novels, in the novels in Taras Bulba, of course, and in Pushkin's novel. And finally, what I wanted to ask you is that if you knew of other examples of paintings in which the author or a author was depicted, so painted with his characters, but without it being obvious, like you showed in your last slide. And it was wonderful because I believe this is something that exists, but there is also something certainly to be said about self-representation, and but this is more a talk about reception again. I'm sorry, but this was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sorry if I rambled a bit.
No, Daria, these are all very interesting ideas, actually. And I mean, I can reflect on some of them, but I'll probably be taking you in a slightly different direction. Of course, I mean, what is important about Pushkin, for example, and Alexander Dalinin wrote about it, is that that this work symbolically functions as a kind of springboard for Slavophile tradition. So whenever you think about, you know, any kind of reflections on that reflects a tradition of Slavophile, and of course, I mean, Yesenin is also on some level is part of this tradition, of course. So it all goes back to Pushkin in some ways. And especially because when he completed his novel on 19th of October, which is itself a symbolic date, the anniversary of the Lyceum, he's also writing a critique, a letter to Chadaev. So he opens this kind of conversation about Slavophile culture and Western culture. So in this way, it is quite important. What is interesting about Repin's painting, actually, is that there are two different versions that exist. And actually, in another version, which I believe is located in one of the museums in Kharkiv, the clerk actually looks much more like Yavarnitsky, which is interesting. Although, I mean, actually, in different memoirs that I have read, everyone acknowledges that it's Yavarnitsky rather than Gogol. But when you actually look at the painting, it looks like Gogol. I'm not a great expert on art, so to speak, so I wouldn't know about other characters. But of course, I mean, there is another famous painting by Ivanov, for example, The Appearance of Christ to the People, where Gogol is definitely depicted. And this is well documented, historically documented. He is the closest to the Christ, standing, searching for truth, so to speak. So it's a slightly different angle. And it's Gogol himself rather than a writer surrounded by different his own characters, so to speak. But but still something, at least something there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. As I was listening to you, I thought of something else. Just two words. I think it would be wonderful to see, maybe it was already done, but how the representations of both Pushkin and Gogol evolved during the 19th and then the 20th century, and on which part of their works did those representations draw on, whether on Pushkin's more well, I think the first answer anyway is quite obvious, because the official representation of Pushkin draws on its painting by Kipriensky and not on this inversum mundi aesthetics that you described. But I think it would be interesting to see if this aesthetic, this Petrushka aesthetic, actually was also used maybe in Pushkin, in representations of Pushkin during the 20th century, and of Gogol, of course. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it would be really interesting. And actually, it's there are so many different illustrations of Gogol in particular, of his works. Of course, I mean, Gogol is very visual, like Derzhavin. So you know, I mean, he attracts everyone. Even during the 19th century, early 19th century, when they both are alive, there are still different representations of them, right? I mean, in the portrait that I have shown, Pushkin is actually depicted in his Almaviva cloak, right? Which is quite important because on the one hand, it comes from Beaumarchais' work, but on the other hand, it also has a tartan pattern. And so that's something that connects him with Walter Scott. And actually, both authors were influenced by Walter Scott. And of course, I mean, Scott became very popular at the beginning of the 19th century. He was in charge of the Royal Celtic Society, and he helped to revive tartan.
That was my question.
So that's why we see him with tartan there. But of course, I mean, there are other kind of informal portraits of Pushkin and Gogol that also exist, where they appear in dressing gowns. And the dressing gown itself is a very interesting image, and I just touched based on it a little bit. Of course, I mean, it actually, the importance of a dressing gown in literary tradition goes actually back to Diderot, who wrote about, you know, this kind of farewell to his old dressing gown. And because of him, it also entered the Russian literature. So there is a poem by Vyazemsky, for example, about the dressing gown, a kind of influenced by the same aesthetics. And of course, I mean, both Gogol and Pushkin are appearing in dressing gowns. And with Pushkin, it's Tropinian's portrait. And what is interesting is that the folds of this garment look a little bit like Roman toga as well. So there is also this kind of second layer where it's also about the Decembrists and the culture, Roman culture that is important for Decembrists and likewise for Pushkin to some extent. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
May I have a question?
Sure. Okay, if it's a follow-up question, Gleb, that's fine. Otherwise, we have a question about Alexandra. Is it connected with what we just discussed?
Not with portraits, actually.
Окей, давайте сначала Александра, а потом вы, Глеб. Спасибо. Александра, пожалуйста.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I have two little questions. First question is there a connection between the culture of laughter and the formation of Cossack identity? Did the culture of laughter influence how the Cossacks themselves understood their uniqueness, freedom, liberty? And second question, it's about Gogol. I was just interested, why is there almost no feminine participation in Gogol's humorous culture?
These are all very, very, very good questions, Alexandra. Well, it's hard to say, about the culture of laughter, but of course, I mean, Gogol himself pays a lot of attention, first of all, to dancing, which is, a kind of a different representation of this free spirit as well. So that's something that is important for Gogol. And of course, I mean, any culture of laughter, it's in some ways rebellious. So it might have been. And for Gogol, it's actually quite important. I mean, because remember, what is this, the other story, evening, not where the Cossack, Christmas Eve, right, where the Cossacks are traveling to St. Petersburg to see, where the Cossacks are traveling to St. Petersburg to see Catherine II. And there is also some kind of, rebellion happens because they are not talking in this Russian language, I think, the way they, or in the way they are expected. So of course, I mean, laughter is always, I mean, not always, but it's very much part also of the culture of rebellion. And of course, I mean, it's also about vitality. And I think that's something that is quite important. And with Repin, for example, Repin very much focuses on this culture of laughter. I mean, it's the expressions, that's something that is important for him. And he looks for these different shades of laughter. And for him, it's definitely a representation of Cossack mentality. With Gogol, I feel like this laughter is a little bit subdued. And sometimes it even has kind of a little bit of kind of moralistic worldview, but not always, not necessarily, right? And he enjoys, he enjoys this kind of rebellious freedom of Cossacks as well. With the culture and representations of women, it's quite interesting. And of course, I mean, someone like Karlinsky will probably talk about Gogol's homosexuality, latent homosexuality, but I don't think it's necessarily about that. It simply was the case when the Cossacks who lived in the siege, they actually didn't communicate with women while they were there. There were different kinds of Cossacks. I mean, some of them actually existed outside of the siege, and they provided nourishment, for example, for other Cossacks, and then they lived in their families. And in Gogol's day, we actually see Taras traveling to the siege without his wife. I mean, he does have a wife, but again, women is something that women is something that Gogol struggles with, right? Even in his earlier Ukrainian tales, right? And his Polish maiden, on some level, it is also depicted as some kind of witch, who bewitches the main character, right? So I mean, there is something about women still, there is something lurking there. But what is interesting about Gogol in particular is that Gogol actually relies a lot on these ethnographic sources. You can find, even when he, for example, talks about Jews and how they rented churches, for example, it's all taken from Sreznevsky. It's not something that, that he actually invents himself. So he uses chronicles, he uses all these works, and then he reworks them. And so humor is one of those ways where he's able to defamiliarize this context and actually to add something of his own.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Alexandra. And thank you, Vika. Gleb, пожалуйста, ваш вопрос.
Yes, thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. And back to Repin's picture, one character which is half naked, and can we interpret the nakedness, the absence of dressing, as a kind of dressing, and what it can tell us? And my second question is there any difference in dress description in Taras Bulba versions? There are two versions of Taras Bulba.
Yeah, of course.
Any differences? But first, please, my first question of
could you, thank you, Gleb. Could you please share your screen again so that we can go back to the painting and take a look at the naked guy.
Yeah.
Half naked guy.
Half naked guy, sorry.
So we need to go to the very beginning. How do I do that?
For the very beginning.
Let me end and then maybe go to the very beginning. Oh, there are too many slides.
All right. Okay.
Well, the naked Cossack is actually, I mean, it has been interpreted. It's something that I actually mentioned at the beginning of my talk, but maybe, it was a long sentence. He is a banker. So he plays the cards. And in order for him not to disguise any cards, he doesn't wear a shirt. But of course, I mean, in some ways, it's also about kind of freedom of expression, so to. I mean, he's free in his own body, so to speak, as well, right? And this might be something. This might have been something that was important for Gogol or for Repin. Repin actually. He worked so much on this painting and for so many years, and he would change kind of location of different characters. I mean, the one in Kabinyak, who is wearing this beige Kabinyak, he introduced him very. It was the last figure that he introduced in his painting. And what is also interesting about Repin is that he didn't have a very good imagination, so he always needed to have some to model his paintings on either people or or material objects. He needed to have them. So Yavarnitsky, for example, supplied some of them. So I don't know whether I answered your question or not, Gleb.
Well, I wonder if it's possible to incorporate the naked body in the description of dressing culture.
Yeah. I mean, because culture of dress and undress, so to speak. So that's part of sartorial culture as well. Unfortunately, I mean, I looked actually quite closely at both versions, and there are some other reductions as well, actually. But unfortunately, not so much at clothing itself. I was generally interested in, for example, I mean, a lot of researchers say, for example, that Gogol uses fewer Ukrainian words, for example, in the second version, which is something that we see at the beginning, but I'm not sure how true it is. What is also interesting about both tales, as you know, in his essays, Gogol oftentimes talks about Malorussia, so Little Russia, whereas it was interesting for me to discover that in both versions, he actually mentions only Ukraine, and he uses the word Malorossiyski only once for Kievan for Polish nobles and Kievan nobles as well. So again, there is some kind of tension there. Because I mean, the Parisian Cossacks have their own cultures, so to speak. So that was something that was interesting for me. In terms of clothing, I just somehow I mean, although I study clothing, I looked at some different different details there. What is also interesting, of course, is that he develops their psychology, I mean, of all the characters in the second version. So that's, of course, something that is interesting. And the whole kind of transition from the Cossacks camp to Dubna, the whole kind of path of Andrei, this is something that, of course, is developed in the second version, and there are many more details. Something that is quite interesting there.
Thank you. Yep, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange, right, that I'm working on sartorial culture, but actually didn't pay attention as much, to the differences in clothing in the first and second version.
Well, it's such a large topic,
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gleb, and thank you, Vika. Leticia had a similar question actually about the two different versions of Taras Bulba. We have a question in the chat section by Irina Zhitnikova. Was it after the discovery of the works of Pushkin and Gogol and the paintings of Repin that the Russian people wanted to discover more? Did this possibly influence fashion? Was there a Ukrainian vibe at some point in Russian fashions in the 19th century, I suppose, was part of Irina's question. And I think that's an interesting one.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. The data of the works. Well, the thing is, I wouldn't know, unfortunately, the answer to this question. But what I know, and what is also interesting in some ways, is that, I mean, before Pushkin and Gogol discovered this clothing and sartorial culture, it has been discovered in ethnographic research, right? And from late 18th century, actually, we see those publications starting with Georgi, right? His publication about different people of the Russian Empire, where you can see a lot of garments and visual images of garments. And I would believe that it's something that was quite interesting, although, I mean, I would imagine that not many people had access to these editions. But all these early 19th century and late 18th century ethnographic works, they have a lot of illustrations there and a lot of kind of details about clothing. What is also interesting is that there are so many different types of Cossacks that existed at the beginning of the 19th century. I mean, there are probably at least 10, 15, maybe even 20 that are different kind of Cossack communities that are in different parts of, in Kuban, in the Caucasus, everywhere, in the Urals. I mean, even in the Urals, there are several different types, so to
right. Say. Any малороссийское платье besides русское платье at the Russian court in the 18th century?
But of course, I mean, something like contush, for example, but that wouldn't be necessarily малороссийское. It would have come from Poland, right? So that's something that was worn. And of course, I mean, something to tell you about Pushkin is that he himself loved any kind of ethnic dress. And so for example, in descriptions of Pugachev, I haven't actually seen, I've seen that maybe he wore crimson shalwars. But red wasn't prominent in any descriptions of Pugachev that I have read. But Pushkin liked to wear a Russian short of this color. And also Pushkin himself wore shalwars sometimes, right? I mean, when he was in Moldova and even maybe in when he was in Mikhailovsk. So that is something quite interesting. With Gogol, for example, I mean, his dress is often quite fashionable. I mean, he was an admirer of colorful vests, so that's something that we know about Gogol. But whether he actually wore any other dress,
well, I think it's the hairdo that does it with Gogol, which will be one of my questions. Thank you very much, Igor, пожалуйста.
Thank you for this presentation. So I have a question that's kind of a follow-up to the question concerning shirtlessness or the state of nakedness and cultural culture. So looking at the painting by Repin, what struck me is the amount of weaponry and other accessories that surround the characters and that define them some ways. Would you say that the study of of types of weaponry, of their designs, and their connection to the creation of your personal image or style can also be considered part of sartorial difficult word culture?
Yeah, probably. I mean, especially
you.
because, I mean, certain in the 18th century and in early 19th century, I mean, representatives of different social estates could, some of them could wear certain types of weapons and others couldn't. So I would say that it's definitely a part of someone's identity. And I think that Repin, for example, I mean, he was very much interested in material culture. And as I already mentioned, I mean, he traveled to all these different places that I mentioned earlier to research sartorial culture. And he also, I mean, Yavarnitsky was a collector. A lot of people actually at the beginning of the 19th century, they are collecting this material culture. And so Yavarnitsky gave him boots, he gave him, other kind of objects of material culture. But definitely, I mean, and especially because of the nature of this painting, right? We know that they are writing a response to the Sultan. We know that there is latent aggression present, no matter how funny they might look. And so, of course, I mean, it's also kind of like a warning, I would say, on some level, it also, and also, I mean, it's a kind of representation of masculinity as well, right? I mean, if you think, for example, about Eisenstein, right? For example, I mean, maybe Eisenstein was influenced to some extent by Repin, actually. I mean, something that I have never thought, and maybe, it's a totally stupid idea, but it's possible. No?
Okay, thank you very much.
And excuse me.
Sorry.
I have one small note to add concerning if there was fashion, if Ukrainian clothing became fashionable in the 19th century. So I'm not sure, but I'd like to add that Repin's portrait of Mussorgsky, so in there, Mussorgsky is actually wearing a vyshyvanka.
Interesting.
Sorry, I'm starting to mix up.
But I mean, it's quite important. Thank you very much for this remark, because I mean, Repin himself, what is important about Repin is that he's from Kharkiv. So, I mean, he embraces his Ukrainian heritage very much, I mean, not only that he embraces, I mean, he dresses all his children, in Ukrainian garments while he paints, the Cossacks and other works at that time. And he's also, just like Gogol, he's reading, Ukrainian tales, singing Ukrainian songs, etc. So it's a part of his heritage. I mean, he lives in St. Petersburg, but he actually earns, he really kind of pines for his heritage in this way. So I mean, I can easily understand that he would and that he would depict, Mussorgsky in a Ukrainian garment. But what is something else? Yes, and I think that he has also chosen Sirkor because Ataman Sirko, who is standing over the clerk, because originally in the 19th century, Yavornitsky, who published a lot of works about the Parisian Cossacks, he actually believed that Sirko came from Kharkiv. So there was a connection. I mean, now I think, that this is a question of debates rather than of certainty.
Right. Thank you.
Dasha.
Well, Dasha, I'd rather let Marie ask a question if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
Okay, thank you very much. Marie,
Yes.
if you please. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question about masculinities because you said that they were thought as sorry, I'm quite tired. Half from Kievan Rus and half from Turkey, yes. And like, do you think that there were kinds of models, but not models as like contemporary models, but as models for do you understand what I mean?
So Cossacks, they had clothing that represented different cultures, right? I mean, they live on the borderline, so to speak, and their dress is representative of this kind of borderline state, right?
Their dresses and also their minds, how they present themselves.
How they present themselves. I mean, there are definitely, I mean, I would say that Cossacks are definitely influenced by Turkish cultures, right? Because, I mean, the whole idea of a wanderer rather than a settler, right, comes from these Turkic cultures, right? So in this way, in some ways, I mean, they're mirroring these cultures. But of course, I mean, to some extent, they're also defining themselves a little bit against other cultures, right? I mean, because I think what is also important to understand is that a Cossack is not an ethnicity, right? So they are kind of almost like sometimes militant in defining themselves against the other, to a kind of to strengthen their sense of identity, so to speak. And maybe, I mean, it's expressed in this clothing as well. But I'm not sure, Marie, whether I'm answering your question or whether I'm kind of digressing somewhere else.
No, that's fine. I'm sure that Marie can actually write you if she wants to develop that question of hers. Thank you very much. Daria has a last question, if she can keep it short, so that I can ask my own questions afterwards before we wrap it up.
I'm sorry for disturbances. There may be disturbances, so I think I will rather write. You don't hear us? No, because I'm sorry. Please, Rodolphe, ask your questions, and I will write to you, Vika, with mine. You had a comment about ethnographical atlases of the Russian Empire with the representation of Cossacks. Bye. So sorry.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you, Dasha. Thank you very much. So, yes, I had just two short questions. Actually, I had more, but time is up. So thank you very much again. Vika, I had a question regarding sources because you mentioned Venezianov, and I was wondering about the popularity of Georges Emmanuel Opitz in early 19th century Russia, and if Pushkin and Gogol had access to his caricatures of Russian and Cossack soldiers and Russian officers in Paris in 1814, which are extremely theatrical and which not only represent garments, but also represent the kind of theatrical behavior that, you know, foreigners, I mean, French people would attach to, embodying Russianness, embodying Ukraineness, embodying the Russian Empire visually through garments. So that was my first question. My second question was about the appeal for, you know, representing colors in romantic prose, notably in connection with you know, the topic of freedom. Undoubtedly, tartans in Walter Scott's prose, you know, as you probably said yourself, are connected with, you know, Scotsmen, the fight for independence, the fight for liberty, and so on and so forth. And I was wondering whether this, you know, this appetite for colors in Gogol and Pushkin had something to do with the lack of color in the disciplinary garment of the Russian Empire, and that is, you know, in the chinele, in the forme, and so on and so forth. So you know, I'm always, you know, I saw the famous painting about, you know, the Decembrist, representing the Decembrist upheaval. And it's always fascinating to see the soldiers, which are always dressed the same, of course, because they're in uniforms, and then the extraordinary variety in terms of colors, in terms of palette of the peasants, you know, circling the Senate Square. So what about, you know, color as freedom as opposed to you know, uniformity as a disciplinary tool? Thank you very much.
Well, I think I have seen, you know, those caricatures actually, and I was quite interested actually that, you know, that it wasn't just the Russian thing, that they were also Cossacks were represented in Europe as well. But I don't know the answer to this question. It will be really interesting actually to find the answer, whether they had any access, right? But in terms of colors and uniforms, I mean, you are absolutely right, of course. I mean, Nicholas I's reign is very much connected with uniforms. So uniforms becomes like an order of the day. I mean, uniforms also help to control the population, right? Especially if they are all different for different institutions. So it becomes a language of uniforms. And of course, I mean, it starts even earlier with Catherine II, who already kind of institutes some regional uniforms, etc. But of course, I mean, during Nicholas I's time, it becomes like an epidemic, so to speak. And it's an important question. And because of that, I think, of course, I mean, people like Pushkin and Gogol are reacting against that in many ways. And I do think, as you rightly pointed out, that, you know, the colors is something that also kind of distinguishes these characters as freedom fighters. And of course, I mean, for example, the cap is important as well, right? I mean, there is a commandant who wears a cap. There is Derzhavin, who is depicted in a dressing gown and a cap. And although these are nightcaps, they're also very much reminiscent of the Phrygian cap, a red Phrygian cap, which I actually had on one of the slides. And of course, this kind of cap is also important for Pushkin, for example, because every new chair of the Arzamas Society wore a Phrygian cap, right? Yeah. So I mean, there is a lot more going on there in terms of clothing.
Right. Okay. And
there might be even some religious, you know, I mean, because what we also know about Pugachev, I mean, of course, Pushkin also includes a lot of epigraphs, for example. And one of those epigraphs actually associates Pugachev with the figure of Christ. So this kind of red color, you know, it might be also the color of sacrifice down on some level. And we know that Pugachev was, or at least we believe that Pugachev was 32 years old in 1773. So in 1775, he probably wasn't yet 33, but this is the year when he died. And whether it was real or invented, we don't know.
Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. It's an extremely rich topic, really. And I mean, I'm pretty sure that you have so much more to say besides all the fascinating things that you said today. As I suggested earlier, I think that, you know, a history of hairdos in Russian culture would also be extremely interesting. For instance, Karamzin kept on changing his hairdo, you know, as every new fashion and every new sort of self-creation impulse, you know, I mean, replaced the previous one. And interestingly enough, as you mentioned, and we have a friend and colleague in Strasbourg, Viktoria Ivleva, who was also interested in Gogol's visual transformation as an attempt to embody Ukraineness. And I think that you know, the fact that he used his hairdo and his mustache and not clothing might have a lot to do with questions of the symbolic prestige associated with different cultures. Because, of course, Scottish culture is prestigious enough, you know, in early 19th century Europe, so that you can use garments from Scottish culture as an element of dandyism, for instance, because Scotland is associated with a prestigious kind of landscape because they have mountains. It's associated with the sublime and so on and so forth. It's not the case, as I believe, but I'm not a specialist, you know, when it comes to Ukraine. So using Ukrainian garments or Cossack garments, you know, as an element of dandyism might have seemed strange, which is probably one of the reasons why you had to go with a hairdo. But you know, that's just a hinge. I might be wrong.
But also, I mean, hair is much closer to your identity, to your body. So it might be, you know, on some level, it might be even a better way of representing yourself. So that's quite interesting. What I'm really interested in is where did this hairdo cheveux à la coque came from? Whether, you know, maybe, I mean,
I believe they came from Paris.
Yes. But
like everything else.
But originally, you know, and whether Cossacks had anything to do with that or not, probably not.
Oh, no, probably not. I suppose it's a case of re-Semitization. You know, the whole the coupe à la Brutus and so on, which were so politically overloaded semantically. You know, I mean, they were very important for the political culture of early 19th century. Even though they were blurred because, you know, monarchs could be wearing coupe à la Brutus as well, even though they were monarchs. All right, thank you very much, Vika, for this.
Sorry that I was reading it, but I just thought, you know, that I can put much more if I read.
No, that was fine. Don't worry. That was fine. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and thank you, dear colleagues, dear friends, for you know, attending the especially to our Italian colleagues who are really, you know, very good attenders, and we very much appreciate their presence. And we will see each other, I suppose, Vika and Maria, and maybe even Laura, I heard. Laura, you're coming to Hardesden, right? Lovely. So we will see each other in Hardesden after Christmas. And as for the others, we will see each other, you know, at the beginning of the second semester, which will be run by our dear Daria Sinichkina.
Yes, and thank you, Rodolphe. And we will see each other on February 12th for the first session of the seminar of the second semester. And it will be our great pleasure to welcome Claudia Criveler
from Padova University. I said it with a weird Russian accent, I'm sorry. And she will be speaking about cinema and the Russian symbolism. It will be wonderful.
No, it's just that the sound is very bad, so we hear a lot of S's, and but we got it. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great end of the year.
You
A
too.
merry one.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Vika.
Goodbye.
Bye.